Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. My topic this week is the West now losing the war in Ukraine? Now, you, the listeners and the viewers, may find this somewhat surprising because we've been fed a narrative over the last couple of months of plucky Ukrainians putting up unexpected resistance, of incompetent Russians, particularly the soldiers and the generals, having to retreat with great losses, of very good Western displays of unity, NATO and the EU pulling together, and of course of draconian sanctions being imposed on the Putin regime, which ultimately will force Putin to compromise. His will be bent and the Russians will be forced to withdraw. But of course, like all narratives, they tend to be black and white. Reality is more shades of grey. And this story of plucky Ukrainians and incompetent Russians was always a little bit too good to be true, if we're honest with ourselves. Over the last few weeks, we've been forced to recognize certain realities. The Russians are not fools. They have learned from their mistakes. They're now doubling down in a more concentrated way in the Donbass region, going village by village, using heavy shelling and indiscriminate shelling of civilian targets, and they're driving the Ukrainians back. They've now largely captured the major city of Severodonetsk. They've captured Mariupol and seized, therefore, a further chunk of Ukraine's Black Sea coast. And President Zelensky this week has been obliged to acknowledge that he's losing 100 soldiers a day and Ukrainian forces are being forced to retreat. So the military situation now seems to be more favorable to Russia, which could go on beyond the Donbass to try to renew its aspirations to capture cities, for example, like Kharkiv in the north or even Kiev. The second issue is that the weapons supplies seem to be drying up. Die Welt, the German newspaper, this week reported that Germany, despite its big promises, has only delivered so far two very modest packages of weapons to Ukraine. We've also been hearing more calls for a compromised peace, for example, from Henry Kissinger at the World Economic Forum in Davos last week. The New York Times published an editorial also saying, look, it's now time to stop the fighting, even if it means that Ukraine will have to sacrifice large chunks of its territory. The Italian government has proposed a multi-stage peace plan, and the Ukrainians are worried that the front of unity, which has held very well in the West in support of them thus far, is now starting to crack as people become tired of the war, particularly recognizing its impact on politically unpopular things like higher energy prices or food inflation at home. There are also signs that the sanctions, no matter how draconian, that have been imposed on Russia are not bringing the Russian economy to its heels. This week, the Russian Ministry of Finance, Anton Silvanov, reported that Russia has had a windfall of 14 billion euros so far, simply in terms of the higher price for oil and gas. The EU has transferred about 50 billion euros in oil and gas purchases from Russia since February the 24th alone. And this war chest from energy is allowing, of course, Putin to keep the war going and to replenish his lost tanks of missiles, at least for the foreseeable future. So what is to be done if we are not now going to see Russia turn defeat into some kind of victory and come out of this war in pole position, acquiring much larger chunks of Ukrainian territory? Well, the first thing we need to do is keep up the military supplies to Ukraine. And today at least brought a piece of good news for Kiev, in the sense that President Biden announced that he had now decided to transfer the HIMARS multiple launch rocket system to Ukraine. HIMARS, with a range of 80 kilometers, GPS guided, will allow Kiev to target the Russian forces much more effectively, even if President Biden has ruled out longer range systems like the M270 with a range of up to 300 kilometers, because he's worried that Ukrainians might use this system to attack targets in Russia directly. This American American gesture now needs to be emulated by others. If the Ukrainians can get this long-range artillery, they can stop the Russians advancing, they can inflict severe losses on Putin's army, and they can also successfully launch counterattacks in places like Kherson, where the Russians are less well covered as they double down with all of their forces in the Donbass region further to the east. The second thing is to keep up pressure on Russian energy supplies. This is really the crux of the matter, because this is what Russia is using, as I've said, to finance the war. And this week at least brought some better news for Kiev, with the sixth sanctions package being adopted yesterday by the European Union, which includes an embargo on oil. 27% of Russian oil goes to the EU, and this will deprive Moscow of billions of euros for its war chest. Of course, it's not entirely satisfactory. Hungary imposed an exemption which will allow oil through pipelines to continue, at least for the time being. And we all know that in putting an embargo on Russian gas, which would be the natural next step, is going to be even more difficult for the EU countries, particularly Germany, to agree on. But at least it shows that the EU is continuing to ratchet up the pressure and to develop a long-term strategy for weaning itself on Russian oil and gas. The next thing, which I think has been useful, is that the West is now starting to look at the long-term impact of the sanctions and to come to some kind of an agreement on which sanctions could be lifted if Russia agrees to withdraw its forces and to agree to a ceasefire, and which sanctions need to be kept in place for a longer period, because obviously the West will need to maintain a deterrence should Putin try to start the war again at a later stage. There are also talks going on between the EU, the US, the UK, and others on how to pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine, which will be in the hundreds of billions of dollars through the confiscation of Russian assets abroad. Similarly, there are useful talks going on about how to create humanitarian corridors in the Black Sea with commercial grain vessels under military escort to get more of the Ukrainian grain to market and relieve some of the hunger and food crisis in Africa and the Middle East and beyond. What is going to be important now, particularly with the whiff of peace and compromise in the air, is a Western consensus on what will be the terms for accepting a ceasefire and a peace deal. It can't be just giving in to Putin and allowing him to keep all of the territory which he has seized. This would undermine the functionality of Ukraine as a state in the future and make it even more dependent or long-term on Western economic assistance. And therefore, knowing how to support Ukraine in terms of the demands that it can reasonably make on Moscow, maybe not maximalist, but certainly not minimalist, is going to be key as well. So all is not yet lost in terms of the West's objective to raise the price for Putin, to help Ukraine to regain its territory, and to ensure that Putin is less likely to start a war again. Yes, the Russians have had a couple of good days, but as General de Gaulle reminded us, winning a battle is not quite the same as winning the war, and losing a battle certainly doesn't mean that Ukraine has lost. As Margaret Thatcher famously said to George W. Bush at Aspen, Colorado, back in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, George, this is no time to go wobbly. And this is certainly no time for the West to go wobbly either. Thank you very much for watching this week. Look forward to seeing you again next week.